Combine the psychological horror of Silent Hill with the existential loneliness of Blade Runner, and you might end up with something like Blank Frame, a deeply personal indie horror experience about the slow, suffocating decay of a human soul. It's a story about isolation, alienation, and the desperate search for some kind of personal meaning, I suppose. Today, we'll be exploring this game through the lens of Jungian psychology, examining how its symbols and events might reflect profound truths about the human psyche. We wake up from a loud bang in the hallway of our apartment. Before we investigate, we can look around Henry's bedroom to hopefully get to know him better as a character. First and foremost, we should start with his name, which originates from the old Frankish name Heimrich, meaning home ruler, which, as you'll see, is quite fitting for Henry. He refers to his alarm clock as his arch enemy, and when examining his bed, he says, "Started sleeping at 3 p.m. Probably would have woken up around this time anyway. My sleeping schedule has been a real mess lately. I've been trying to fix it, but..." Looking up out of his bedroom window, we see an empty ad space, which says, "So empty." I think a good way for us to interpret this game is to view all external phenomena as symbolic, the way you might interpret a dream, where Henry's surroundings will tell us more about Henry's inner life, his psychological state, and later on you'll see that the phrase "so empty" is quite significant. When we interact with his computer, he says, "It's busted. I've been trying to save up for a new one. Gotta say, it feels weird when I can't mess around with it. Almost makes you want to go out and do something." Almost. This starts to build a picture of Henry as someone that's disassociated from the overall rhythms of life, of society. It is quite common today for people to lose track of their regular sleep schedule, especially with things like remote work, or perhaps just with the broader mental health struggles of modern people. But it's worth thinking about what it really means to sleep during the day and to be awake only at night. I mean, society operates mostly during the day. People work and socialize during the day. Sleeping through it is to almost symbolically remove yourself from the rest of the world. If we look at it through a Jungian lens, Henry is retreating from what Jung would call the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious being, very basically, the psychological space shared by all humans, where you find Jung's archetypes, the universal, inherited symbols and themes of humanity. It's the source from which culture draws its underlying structure and meaning. By living exclusively in the night, Henry only really contends with the personal unconscious. This is where the personal and private psychological phenomena reside, where you find Freud's personal psychology, the id and the superego that forms someone's personal ego. Of course, it is necessary and helpful to confront and understand one's personal unconscious. However, without the collective unconscious, Henry has nothing to anchor his personal psychological state to. There's no greater human context, and so he lacks meaning, purpose, and of course the most prevalent factor in this game, he lacks connection to others, which is mostly provided by the collective unconscious. And so the night in this game then becomes symbolic for his isolation, and that is basically how we'll interpret the night itself throughout this game. When we leave the bedroom, we see what caused the noise. A massive cabinet has fallen from the apartment above, and is now blocking the exit. Like I said, we should interpret these happenings symbolically, as reflections of Henry's psychological state. In his current state, the outside world is completely cut off. It's inaccessible. Inaccessible? Unaccessible? I don't know. And more importantly, this cabinet comes from the apartment above, a place we'll later learn is deeply connected to Henry, and we could even interpret it as a physical manifestation of Henry's psyche itself. But we'll get to it later, obviously. We can't call anyone for help, as there was a big storm the day before, and the phone lines aren't working. When we head over to the living room, the first thing that'll capture our attention is a sound coming from the window. A piece of paper is being held up by the wind. It reads, "Nursing walls have grown tired. Dormant lungs need their cleansing before the night vacates them completely. Winds of vastness are waiting with open arms. Opening an eye and an ear to the world is the first step." There's a few messages like this in the game, and they're all sort of cryptic, so let's try to unpack it phrase by phrase. Nursing walls have grown tired. This might be referring to Henry's own apartment, which at one point probably served as a kind of protective, comforting space for him to retreat to, shielding him from the chaos of the outside world. But these so-called nursing walls have, grown tired. So that defense mechanism is no longer nurturing him. Dormant lungs need their cleansing before the night vacates them completely. This line suggests a kind of internal stagnation. Henry's lungs, his capacity to breathe, to live, are dormant, and so they need air, they need to be rejuvenated, they need life. And the night's extreme seclusion and loneliness only serves to remove life from them completely. So if nothing changes, it'll consume him, or even kill him. Winds of vastness are waiting with open arms. This could be a piece of foreshadowing to a character we'll meet later, who is strongly associated with openness. On a symbolic level, this phrase, and I guess subsequently that character, could also tie into Carl Jung's collective unconscious. The winds of vastness might represent that deeper connection to the outside world that Henry is greatly lacking. And then finally, opening an eye and an ear to the world is the first step. This just reads to me like an invitation for Henry to participate in the world again. The sort of main piece, the most eye-catching piece of this living room, I suppose, is this, get ready for it, blank frame. And then there's a newspaper on the table, but Henry doesn't like reading the news because it always pisses him off. The first headline reads, "The young are starting to drift away from society," which fits eerily well with Henry's present condition. The others talk about the closing down of some cave and the failure to catch a prolific rapist. One has to imagine this being quite destructive towards one's psyche, where the only source of interaction with the outside world is through these bleak news stories. I suppose it is a sort of contact, but there's no real connection. It leaves you entirely without agency. It leaves you alone with the worst parts of reality, with no meaningful way to respond to it. And this is made worse when we examine the TV and DVD sets in Henry's apartment. He seems to prefer horror and thriller films, or shows, and expresses a clear disdain for romantic comedies, because he can't relate to them anyway. Henry's preference for horror, or just darker media, but more importantly his rejection of rom-coms, which are obviously centered around love and connection, could be seen as a form of avoidance. He would much rather engage with stories that more closely mirror his inner life, his inner turmoil, that perhaps validate his isolation, while distancing himself from any showcase of intimacy. In Psychology and Religion, Carl Jung tells us, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. So by rejecting the connection between people that romantic comedies are full of, Henry is avoiding a deeper confrontation with his loneliness. Those rom-coms most likely remind him of his isolation. This then hurts him, so he just doesn't engage with them, which then reinforces this neurosis. We grab this antenna from our bedroom and use it on the radio. This horrible sound starts playing and we get an angry knock on the door. It's our neighbor, Mr. Inha, which according to my deep research, in Finnish can mean wicked, bad or disgusting or gross. We try to explain that we are stuck and need help, but he can't quite hear us because of the cabinet. Henry sees that he has to do something if he's going to get out of this, and thinks about escaping through a window, although he refuses to use the living room window because he would be ashamed if people saw him climbing down. So he decides on the bedroom window, as it's facing this more secluded alley. He gets some bedsheets together and gets ready to go down. But there's a drunk girl in the alleyway. We ask for help, but again get misunderstood. She calls Henry a creep and asks him if this is some kind of fetish. I'm not really sure how this could be interpreted as a fetish, but besides that, she's actually very understanding. Luckily, it was only a plastic bottle and we didn't get hurt. We abandon the bedsheet idea and move on to something else, although there appears to be something in the window across from us. We grab a knife from the kitchen to cut a piece of the plastic bottle, cut ourselves in the process, and throw the knife out the window, for some reason. Using the cut piece of plastic, we get into the apartment's storage room to find, behind some boxes, a small hole in the wall, looking over the hallway of the apartments. There we see Miss Meadows, Henry's next-door neighbor. He says he gets nervous when he passes by her in the hallway. He has a bit of a crush on her, even though he's never talked to her, and that her gorgeous green eyes scare him. These are two important things for you to remember. That first, Miss Meadows is strongly associated with the color green, and that although Henry is clearly interested in getting to know her, he's scared of her, and so doesn't. I think you can already see how this relates to Henry's avoidance of connection we talked about before. And coincidentally, when we leave the storage room, we find this advertisement pamphlet under the door for a dating service, which Henry sort of dismisses by saying, do people actually use those sites? This shows up just after we look at Miss Meadows. So again, we see how physical, material phenomena is strongly associated or even dependent on Henry's mental state. Moving on though, we use a mop to move the cabinet slightly so that we can get into the bathroom. In the bathroom window is the TV remote, and we get to see that Henry's bathroom window overlooks a strip club called Lovey and an establishment called the Porn Caesar. When we examine one of the Porn Caesar's patrons, Henry thinks, this guy makes me sick. Is this what he does all night? Every night? Now, this man is engaging in the activity one would expect in a place called the Porn Caesar. I mean, we are looking at the self-acclaimed Roman Empire of pornography. Now, Henry has not only memorized one of its loyal patrons, but is also sickened by him, watching a man sort of mired in his own isolation, engaging in this kind of aimless pursuit of pleasure. But at the same time, Henry is himself stuck in his apartment, not engaging with the world in any real way, avoiding any real intimacy or form of connection, and he himself watches adult material, as you can see from this Kleenex box next to his computer. He just happens to have a computer at home while this horny fellow does not. Perhaps the discomfort comes from Henry witnessing an aspect of his Jungian shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of one's unconscious that they repress, characteristics, traits, and emotions that they don't want or refuse to acknowledge within themselves. Henry could be projecting a part of his shadow onto this man. In the essay Archaic Man, Jung tells us, projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. Henry's reaction to this man could be a reaction to seeing a version of himself he doesn't want to face, a man wasting away in isolation, disconnected from others, and getting this sort of simulation of connection. But moving on, we use the remote on the TV to see Henry's favorite, a rom-com, a man and a woman talking in a field, perhaps crash landing on you. Yoon said he probably just landed in North Korea. By the way, how good was that side story between Dan and Song-joon? I mean, it's such a great show. Don't even get me started on that group of knuckleheads. Such an endearing dynamic they had with the main cast and the way that they kind of... I never watched it though, cause that would be gay. Anyway, the first channel is really what we should be focusing on. It reads, hope is still discernible ahead, but mockingly so after years of void. The pit's outgrowth, corruption stains the path. Now we have to find a number associated with each color. Hope in green, which like I said is strongly associated with Miss Meadows, is found in this picture frame, still with the default family picture you get when you first buy the frame. So you can see how hope is directly correlated with some form of connection. Void in purple is found on the empty at space, the one that says so empty. Of course, mirroring Henry's own empty life, devoid of meaning, lonely and disconnected from the collective unconscious. And then corruption in pink is found in an adult magazine that we fish out of the toilet, which perhaps could be saying something about the possible dangers of adult entertainment, how it could shape or misshape the way a maladjusted man like Henry can view connection, but more importantly, how it can distort his view of intimacy into something purely carnal or even just transactional. Now, before we solve the TV puzzle, I think it's worth mentioning this moment that happens while you're in the middle of solving it. When we go to the bedroom, our bedsheet rope thing falls off, and Henry thinks, oh great, the sheets fell down. Seems like the knot was too loose. Well, I'm glad I didn't start climbing down with that. I can't seem to tie a knot to save my life. I ought to learn that stuff at some point. If not to save my life, then I'm being dramatic. I'm gonna make it. I'm just stuck here for a while. Now, I believe that if you complete that phrase that Henry didn't finish, or didn't want to finish, you would probably get, I ought to learn that stuff at some point. If not to save my life, then to end it. We won't go over this subject just yet, as there's a more appropriate time later. But the way you solve the TV puzzle is you grab the number associated with each color and theme, so hope is 2, void is 0, and corruption is 6, then order them correctly. So hope is mentioned as a possible future, so 2 is last. The void is in the past, or has been the past, so 0 is first. And then corruption is what's standing in the way of hope. so 6 is the middle number. This was a really cool puzzle, and it's a shame it's the only real puzzle like this in the whole game. I mean, I was honestly stumped for a while. I was so stumped, I genuinely spent 10 minutes fucking around with a toilet seat. You flip the channels in this order, and the screen of the CRT falls off. Inside is the word knock, so we do just that. Someone knocks back. It's our next door neighbor, Miss Meadows. We try to open the window, but it's half stuck, and we have some trouble communicating. Perhaps you've noticed that this is a constant theme. Henry consistently has trouble communicating, or is just misunderstood, and now he has to be screaming in order to be heard. And this can be symbolic for Henry's overall isolation and lack of connection, or difficulty connecting. So very relatable. The interaction at first seems to go similarly to the one with the drunk girl, but Henry manages to actually express to Miss Meadows that he is stuck in his apartment and needs help. And she's quite receptive to his plea, and offers to help. But before they start doing anything, she thinks they should introduce themselves. Her name is Ava Meadows. Ava, according to my in-depth research, is Finnish for open, so her name is quite literally Open Meadows, which is definitely symbolically important. She's already associated with the color green, with hope, as a way out of the void. And Open Meadows is, in a symbolic way, the exact opposite of Henry's current shut-off, isolated state. Their first idea is for Henry to slide his apartment keys under the door, so that Ava could unlock it and push the cabinet from the other side. They try that, but it doesn't really do anything. But Ava has another idea and tells us to go back to the window. She suggests we climb down the window with some bed sheets. We explain that we've already tried that and lost our sheets, and got hit in the face with a bottle. So we apologize for bothering her, and we kinda just leave it at that. When we go to the bedroom curtains have been sewn shut, and we could interpret this as the shadow, the often ugly and repressed part of the self, lashing out, dragging Henry towards further isolation. But why? Well, maybe because Ava represents something that Henry wants. She represents the possibility of hope, of connection, of some sort of redemption. But along with that desire comes the fear of being seen, being judged, or worse, being outright rejected. In the Vision seminar, Carl Jung tells us, when one tries to be good and wonderful and perfect, then all the more the shadow develops a definite will to be black and evil and destructive. People cannot see that. They are always striving to be marvelous. And then they discover that terrible, destructive things happen which they cannot understand. And they either deny such facts have anything to do with them, or they admit them. They take them for natural afflictions, or they try to minimize them and shift the responsibility elsewhere. The fact is that if one tries beyond one's capacity to be perfect, the shadow descends into hell and becomes the devil. Henry, with Ava, is confronted with a kind of ideal, someone he wants to impress, to be perfect and good and marvelous for. But the more he tries to present himself as great and deserving of her time, the more violently the shadow resists. So there's this kind of internal war between the parts of Henry that want to heal and progress, and the parts that have grown accustomed to this solitude, and tell Henry that solitude is his rightful place. When we go back to the living room, the blank frame falls and shatters, and we take a glass shard with us. But now on the frame is another one of those cryptic notes, like the one that was in the window. It reads, "The night is long and powerful. Reliance on a stranger is vital, and the forgotten sign of trust brings the two back together. As delight, emptiness is already lesser." Again, these notes are a little cryptic, so let's again unpack it phrase by phrase. The night is long and powerful. Well, the night, as we talked about before, could be symbolic for Henry's overall solitude, or at least that's how I'm interpreting it. Reliance on a stranger is vital, and the forgotten sign of trust brings the two back together. Now, when the note mentions the stranger, this might very well be Ava. However, we can interpret the stranger, and subsequently Ava, as a physical manifestation of the collective unconscious itself. Ava, as a stranger, becomes a bridge, not just between Henry and another person, but between Henry and the rest of the human experience. So she's the bridge towards connection, vulnerability, and therefore, to Henry, the unknown. In a way, she becomes more than just a stranger. She's almost like an ultimate test, because Henry fears her much more than any other random stranger. Not because she herself is threatening, but because of what, in Henry's mind, she demands. that he open up, allow himself to be seen, and of course risk being rejected. And let's not forget the symbolism in her name. Ava Meadows translates to open meadows. While that might sound nice and pleasant, it can also represent the terrifying open-ended nature of the collective unconscious, of the outside world. Like a meadow stretching as far as the eye can see, it's beautiful, but in a sense, chaotic, filled with infinite possibilities. And that is exactly where anxiety is born from. Not from the fear of one particular thing going wrong, but from the infinite ways in which all things could go wrong. As delight, emptiness is already lesser. This last line essentially tells us that even the smallest of actions can be enough to begin to dispel this void, this emptiness. That even that small act of Henry reaching out, building that small little connection, no matter how insignificant, already begins to weaken the grip of the night, of the solitude. We then use the glass shard to cut the wires holding the curtains together. But we need to get Ava's attention again, because she still has our apartment key. But she can't hear us knocking on the TV. So we grab an eraser and then some dental floss from the bathroom. We combine the eraser and the dental floss and throw it out her window. But before she gives us our keys, Henry gets another idea. I suppose after noticing that couple in the alley, Henry thought that maybe Ava could use that payphone next to them to call for help. She again is very willing to help Henry and agrees to go. And Henry tells her to be careful because something weird is going on tonight. I guess he can't really say what he's seen, as that would make him look a little... But she thinks he's talking about a group known as the Lincoln Street Junkies, which we'll learn more about later. She then notices how quiet it's gotten, and that it's much easier to talk now, which itself could be symbolic for Henry and Ava's connection slowly building. After a while she says, "You don't get out much, do ya?" And Henry responds, "Well, there's not much out there for me. You're the quiet type. I do go for a walk every now and then. At night, in the woods. You're just a weirdo, aren't ya?" A lot of time, yes. Well, that's fine. I'm a bit of a weirdo myself. Ava then says she likes to explore abandoned places and take pictures of them. And she also likes to go out into the woods, like Henry, except she says she goes much deeper. Now, if we look at this through a Jungian lens, we could see the woods as a representation of a person's unconscious, where their shadow would reside. So in that sense, it does make sense that Ava would go much deeper than Henry, as she seems to be a bit more well-adjusted and self-assured, and therefore would be much more comfortable with what Jung called shadow work, which is the process of recognizing and sort of accepting your shadow. She also mentions some cabins deep into the woods that her mother said were used by people called dream seers or something. In Jungian psychology, dreams can be used as a sort of tool for understanding one's unconscious. Jung believed that dreams were not random or meaningless, that they carried a vital symbolic message from the unconscious mind. They're full of both personal and universal meaning, so meaning related to the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. But what I found most fascinating was the interaction they had just before. It was as if Henry was bracing for judgment and rejection when Ava teasingly says, "You're just a weirdo, aren't you?" Even the music from her TV cuts out, almost like Henry is holding his breath, waiting for a total rejection of himself after he opened up just a little bit. And then this pleasant track starts to play. She reassures him, "Well, that's fine. I'm a bit of a weirdo myself." What I really like about this moment isn't necessarily that Henry is understood. I mean, he is. But it's more so that he's accepted. In Carl Jung's letter, he writes, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." So this would imply that everyone, to some extent, carries a lot of internal messiness. We all carry a shadow. Ava seems to some extent recognize and accept her own, and so is able to see and accept Henry's, whereas Henry, up until now, has tried to deny his own shadow, because he most likely assumes others don't have one. And so she makes her way to the alley to use the phone. After some waiting, we hear a scream. She found that knife we threw out the window and thought she found some kind of murder weapon. But we explained that everything is fine. We just throw knives out the window because it's fun. For the lols. Your Honor, it was for the lol. She does this strange diaper walk towards the phone, but it seems someone has broken it. So we ask her to try the grill place across the street. I mean, that is a weird walk, isn't it? And we wait once more. She takes a very long time, and Henry starts thinking maybe he should have just not bothered anyone and waited until morning. Some sort of phantom shows up behind us. It looks like it's hanging or floating, and seems to have what looks like clock hands on its feet, which I guess is fitting since it appears under the clock. This clock phantom is clearly heavily connected to time itself, as a looming weight on Henry. This would fit perfectly with Henry's overall psychological state. Time, for him, becomes symbolic of all the time wasted, rotting away in his apartment. Time becomes symbolic for decay, and I suppose death itself. Henry actually has an interesting and very relatable line when looking out into the sky. He says, "Night is like an understanding friend. At night, I feel more normal." In a Jungian sense, the day is when we utilize our Jungian persona the most. The social mask we use to navigate the world, shaped by societal expectations and norms. It's what helps us live our daily lives in a pro-social manner. So the day is a time of visibility, and therefore a time of scrutiny. But Henry struggles under that. And it's only gotten worse as he isolates and becomes more and more detached from the collective unconscious. But the night, on the other hand, is quiet. It's withdrawn and empty. It doesn't ask anything of him, and this I believe reflects his internal landscape. It's lonely, empty, and removed. It's no surprise he feels so at home in it. In the solitude of the night, the world finally mirrors his internal state. Much like his rejection of rom-coms and love of horror and thriller, the night ends up validating his psychological state. We wait even more for Ava, and when we go to check how long we've been waiting, we notice the hour hand is now missing from our clock. We find it in that little peephole in the storage room, along with some dripping blood. When we look through the peephole, we see the clock phantom again. The dripping blood, I think, helps reinforce the idea of it being related to decay and eventual death. We see from Ava's clock that it's 2 a.m., and so we align our clock with hers. And when we do, we see her. This Ava, whose name is now Ave, which according to my back-breaking research means phantom or ghost in Finnish, doesn't respond to us, only repeating certain words that Henry says. Here's everything she repeats in order. Ava is Henry, something wrong, empty, up here, same as before, repeating, useless. Now the first few words are interesting. She says Ava is Henry, and this could lend some credence to the theory that Ava isn't actually real, or at least not in a material sense. However, I personally prefer to believe that Ava is in fact a real individual, only this manifestation of her isn't. We could then view this particular manifestation of her as a representation of Henry's Jungian anima, the anima being, basically, the inner feminine aspect of a man's psyche, and the animus the masculine aspect of a woman's psyche. The anima, according to Jung, embodies emotion, intuition, connection, and is a very important bridge for a man's unconscious. If this Ava is Henry's anima, then this scene, where she repeats his words back to him, could be symbolic of Henry, in a sense, talking to himself, especially since she deliberately only repeats words Henry has already said. She does not generate anything new. The words and phrases something wrong, empty, up here, same as before, repeating, and useless are eerily familiar to things Henry will say a little bit later, things that reflect his self-defeating, pessimistic view of himself, his inability to connect to others bolstered by his own lack of self-confidence. And I think it's also significant how this happens after we synchronize the clock with Ava's, another symbolic step in Henry's growing connection with her. And as soon as we do that, that part of him attempts yet again to isolate him, telling him that solitude is in fact where he belongs. When we leave and go to the hallway, we hear some noises from the above apartment. Like I said in the beginning of the video, the upstairs apartment could be interpreted as a physical manifestation of Henry's psyche itself. I think it's quite interesting that right as Ava leaves him to go to the grill, as he is again left alone, comes this extreme psychological disquietness. And we also have to take into account how hard Henry is trying to escape this apartment. I mean, Henry has clearly been lonely and isolated for a long time before this, but now that he has no option but to be in solitude, he's desperately trying to escape. This would show that he never truly wanted to be isolated in the first place. In a Jungian sense, Henry's isolation could be seen as a part of his Jungian persona, the mask we wear to navigate the world, or I guess, in his case, avoid it. The persona is mostly shaped by societal expectations, but it would also contain some of your personal defenses, and for Henry, it might look like a kind of hardened, stoic detachment, a sort of, I don't need to go out, I don't need people, whatever, you know? That detachment then becomes part of his identity. But we can see that deep down, it's a lie he tells himself to protect himself from pain and possible rejection. But anyway, Ava is actually at the window now, like for real this time, and she says she fell asleep over at the grill, but that either way, no one showed up, so she couldn't ask anyone if she could use the phone. Then the two of them start wondering about the upper floors. I mean, this cabinet fell down from the apartment above, so does no one live there? Ava says the entire floor is vacant, and she mentions how they've even blocked the stairs up to the 4th floor, which we can see from the peephole. Ava believes it has something to do with that group, the Lincoln Street Junkies, taking drugs or doing their weird rituals. Since Ava loves to photograph old shit, Henry asks her if she could take a picture of the floor above. After taking the picture, she points the camera towards Henry, and takes another. She looks at it and says, cute. She then makes her way to our apartment to slide the picture of the upstairs window under the door. And Henry's like, did she just take a freaking picture of me? That's kind of weird. But deep down, you know, he's like, she is again taking a little longer than normal. So we go to the peephole to check if she's okay. In the hallway, we see Mr. Inha harassing Ava. And so we have to figure out some way to help her, and fast. While searching for something to help her, we see this strange man with a long metal snout or trunk thing. It's a little hard to tell what it is exactly. He is struggling to hold it up, and it looks like it's sort of forked at the end. Now, Henry is stuck inside, both literally and symbolically. We have seen that his isolation, his loneliness, has been to some extent integrated into his persona. Solitude has become part of the mask that he wears. But now he finds himself in a new position. He has begun to care for Ava, but she exists outside his apartment, outside his boundaries. Helping her requires reaching beyond this isolation. And it's at this moment that we see this man with this long metal snout in the window. Could this man, who struggles to hold up this snout or trunk, who struggles to hold up his face, be symbolic for Henry's internal battle between his constructed lonesome persona and his repressed desire to connect to Ava? And then the forking at the end of the snout might also point to this psychic fracture between his conscious and unconscious desires. But anyway, we combine our alarm clock with some dental floss to swing it through our bathroom window into Mr. Inha's apartment. He gets distracted by the sound, and Ava is then finally able to slip the photo under our door. It's a blurry picture of the upstairs window. The apartment looks almost abandoned with its broken window frames. But Henry notices something interesting. This picture doesn't make any sense. The angle is completely wrong. We should be seeing it from below. Instead, it looks basically parallel to the camera, as if Ava took it from the upper floor herself. Or could it be that Ava actually slipped the picture she took of Henry, and for whatever metaphysical reason it shows up like this? Or Henry perceives it like this? I don't really think the logistics of this really matter. I think what this serves to do from a narrative standpoint is connect the upper apartment to Henry. It's essentially saying that that space up there is intrinsically related to Henry. And again, recall those repeating words, empty up here. We meet up with Ava at the window, and before we can talk about this picture, Ava seems a bit disturbed by what just happened. Ava and Henry agreed to go rest. It is pretty late after all. She walks away and turns off her lights. We make our way to the bedroom, but as we do, those green eyes show up on our screen. Those green eyes that Henry was so intimidated by. That man is no longer in the opposite window. There is, however, below it now, a couple, lovingly swaying backwards and forwards. When we go to bed, Henry thinks to himself, I'm pretty tired. I hope she's alright. Probably hates me for making her do all this stuff for me. I always screw everything up. Nothing ever changes. We see here more clearly Henry's self-defeating attitude, eerily similar to Ave's repeating words. She said, same as before, repeating, useless, which sort of confirms that she was indeed a sort of reflection of some of Henry's more deeply hidden inner monologue. Then we have the green eyes, tied of course to Ava and hope and connection. They show up, but they're not really comforting. They kind of confront Henry, and us, the player, I guess. They show up right after Henry steps outside his emotional comfort zone to help someone else. Someone he, dare I say, is building a real connection to. Someone Henry is really beginning to care about. That is progress. But like we talked about before, his shadow does not accept this progress. It resists and is essentially telling him, you didn't help, you ruined everything, she probably hates you. I think this moment shows, more clearly than any other moment, the psychological conflict within Henry. Connection versus isolation, growth versus retreat. And that swaying couple could symbolize the connection he could move towards, while Henry's unconscious brings forward Ava's sad green eyes. How he's actually screwing everything up. Of course, it's irrational for Henry to be so hard on himself here. After all, it's not his fault that Ava was harassed by that man. He could never have predicted it, much less prevent it. But he did step in to help in whatever way he could. For someone deeply isolated as Henry, this kind of self-blame sort of makes sense, in a sad way. Henry is almost entirely detached from the collective unconscious, from the outside world in general. And for many, isolation becomes a coping mechanism. Isolation becomes a way of reclaiming control in a world that feels overwhelming and chaotic. I mean, the outside world is frankly a mess. It's horrible, really. All sorts of things happen to us and around us, and we can't do anything about it. They can be annoying or downright dangerous. Other people have their own little idiosyncrasies that you have to contend with and try not to flip out and take their head off. For someone more inclined to neuroticism like Henry, retreating into solitude can feel safer than engaging with a world where everything is uncertain and things can go wrong in a nearly infinite amount of ways. In his apartment, things are relatively stable and controlled, even if stagnant. So when he does engage with the outside world and something awful happens, even if it's not his fault, his instinct is to internalize it. I assume at some point his mind made the conclusion that connection brings vulnerability, vulnerability brings failure, and that failure is so painful, it outweighs any positive aspect that might come from connection. We are woken up by the sound of the phone ringing. However, when we get to it, the ringing stops and the lines are indeed still dead. When we go back to the bedroom, this tall monster lady shows up outside, and the Silent Hill inspiration is really on the nose with this one. I mean, it literally looks like the Mandarin from Silent Hill 2, or the Closer from Silent Hill 3. We could see her as a distorted representation of Henry's Jungian anima. She's scantily dressed, her cleavage is exposed. She's wearing a short skirt and fishnet stockings. Visually, she evokes an archetype of a seductress. In Jungian terms, the seductress can be understood as a projection of an immature anima. An archetypal image that embodies sort of unchecked desire, or just a broad emotional intensity, promising connection, but then misleads and in some way overwhelms. This doesn't necessarily mean that Henry views all women this way, although one might project this archetype onto the women around him. I think it's more so about how he experiences his own desire for connection. That part of him that wants to be seen and understood feels invalid to him in some way. In this way, she might also bring forward the archetype of the femme fatale, as an embodiment of Henry's fear that some emotional vulnerability would lead to shame or destruction. Then we see that her face comprises entirely of a smile. We could interpret this as a shadow aspect of the anima, a more judgmental and critical side of it. Keep in mind, this is getting a little bit more post-Jungian and a little more interpretive. Let's call it the critical feminine. This is the inward judgmental voice that says, you're not good enough, you're unlovable, and will always be unlovable. We've already seen Henry echo this sentiment, telling himself he screws everything up and always will. He even projects this self-loathing onto Ava, who for the most part has only shown him kindness. She related to him at times and has only tried to help him. That smile then could become symbolic of a mockery of Henry's attempts to connect. And if we're talking about shadow anima archetypes, we might as well talk about the apartment itself. This place, this little sealed-off world, could be seen as a manifestation of the devouring mother archetype. Unlike the Great Mother, who nurtures, empowers, and supports a man's individuation, the devouring mother offers safety at the cost of individual growth. It's not that she doesn't offer protection, it's that she protects so much it becomes suffocating and discourages any form of independence. And Henry's apartment doesn't exactly comfort him, not really. It really only serves to keep him small. It's essentially an infantile form of pain avoidance. The tall monster lady wants us to open the window, and this is the turning point of the game. If you decide to confront this shadow aspect of the anima, you'll get the good ending, and in Jungian terms, achieve individuation. If you run away and then she disappears, Henry will afterwards comment that there's still something lingering, which flows well with my Jungian interpretation, since repressing these shadow aspects of the anima will not make them disappear. It'll only cause them to fester and become even more rotten, and so we get the bad ending. We will go through the game now from the perspective of running away, as doing so will give us some more information about the game's overall lore. It basically only changes the very ending, so after we've gone through the bad ending, I'll then tell you about the good ending from the point where things actually start to change. Does that make sense? So we leave into the hallway and see that the light is flickering. Something's in it. We use a stool to reach up there and find another one of those cryptic notes. It reads, "The night is darkest before dawn. End is near. For one, beginning of the end, and for the other, end of the beginning. One of whom is a reminder of hope, the other the lack thereof. Both are one and the same. They cannot coexist after the night." So we'll go phrase by phrase like usual. The night is darkest before dawn. This line to me seems to bring forward an idea of transformation. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung tells us, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So in a Jungian sense, the night, besides being symbolic for his isolation, as we talked about before, could symbolize the inner darkness, the shadow Henry must face. And dawn would be the potential for growth, but only if he chooses to confront what's within, which we didn't. For one, beginning of the end. For the other, end of the beginning. This could represent both endings in the game. In the good, hopeful ending, let's call it, Henry fights the monster, symbolically facing his shadow. The end of the beginning would be the end of isolation, and the start of something new, of connection. And in the ending we're on now, where Henry avoids the confrontation, is the beginning of the end. There's no confrontation, and therefore there's no growth. A continuation of his isolation, until that eventually consumes him. One is a reminder of hope, the other the lack thereof. Both are one and the same. This could mean both endings stem from Henry's psyche. This would track well with what we've been talking about. This could be saying that both endings are reflections of what he's willing or unwilling to face within himself. One is a reminder of hope, as Ava will be present in it, and the other the lack of hope, because Ava will not be present. Although I guess you could also interpret this message to mean that Ava is not real. Like I said, I prefer to believe that Ava is in fact real, but the opposite is very possible as well. But the final line, at least for me, makes me think that this is more so referring to the endings. They cannot coexist after the night. The night, this whole journey through Henry's psyche, will end, and only one version of him can remain. The Henry who faces darkness and moves towards healing, or the one who retreats and lets the night consume him, lets solitude consume him. When we come back into the room, after that comment about something still lingering, because we ran away from the tall monster lady, we see this on the computer screen. Perhaps this is symbolic of the two possible choices, and subsequently the two endings. You'll notice this image is actually a composite of two faces. The one facing us could represent a direct confrontation with the tall monster lady, with Henry's shadow aspect of his anima, and the other is a profile view of the face, possibly representing the avoidance of the tall monster lady, the path we're on right now. After walking around a bit, Ava knocks on the wall. She also heard the phone ringing, but we explained that the lines are still not working. I guess it might not just be Henry who's seeing and hearing things. They start talking about the Lincoln Street junkies again, and how they've been up on the floor above, which, if you remember, has been completely shut off with that gate. She says she wants to go and see the apartment above us. Perhaps she could just kick the cabinet down. We tell her that we can keep lookout on the gate while she explores. She asks how. We tell her that we have a cool peephole in our storage room. She says we're creepy. We go and grab a hammer and chisel from the storage room, and Henry apparently used to be in a workshop carving statues, and he used to enjoy it. We never truly get to know how Henry got to be the way he is now, but I guess it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it happened. Anyone could quietly, slowly end up like Henry. It doesn't take some grand event which changes everything. I guess life can just sort of chip away at you. Dozens of things line up in the worst way possible until one day you don't recognize the shape that you've become. Unrecognizable, even to yourself. Anyway, we grab that and throw the hammer over to Ava so she can break the lock on the gate. After waiting a while, she eventually gets the door to the upstairs apartment unlocked. She still had our apartment keys. She never actually gave them to us. And somehow, our apartment key fits perfectly into the apartment above. This again, I believe, is symbolic for how the upstairs apartment is intrinsically linked to Henry and his apartment. Ava begins stomping on the cabinet and we finally get it unstuck. But the noise woke up Mr. Inha. Ava says she'll go talk to him and leaves. But before we go up there, what is in this cabinet? We use the chisel to pry it open. Inside we see the exact same poster that's in our cabinet. An elephant on a tree branch and the phrase, "hang in there." And under it, a rope, tied into a noose. The symbolic value of this is quite obvious, and we'll expand on it a little later. We pull the cabinet down and use the noose to pull ourselves into the upper floor. This apartment has the same layout as Henry's. The most striking similarity, however, would have to be the blank frame in the living room, just like the one in Henry's apartment. When we go to the bedroom, we see a man. They have quite a long interaction, so I'll condense it down a bit. He's part of those Lincoln street junkies, and he says he's a peeker for them. I suppose they are more organized than the name would imply. The conversation is strange and dreamlike. One of the most interesting things the peeker talks about is lovi, a kind of invisible residue or force, something dark that lingers beneath everyday life. According to my insane journalistic level research, in Finnish mythology, Lovi refers to a supernatural place, possibly between the real world and the underworld. If we view it through a Jungian lens, Lovi could be sort of the shadow of the collective unconscious, as the shared hidden darkness of humanity. You might notice that the strip club we can see from the bathroom window is also called Lovi. The peeker suggests that, in that context, it means something else. Since Lovi can also mean a V-shaped cut, it could maybe be sort of an inside joke among their group, especially since in this game, the strip club or the adult magazine are hinted at being sort of corrupting forces, as a sort of fake form of connection. Towards the end of the conversation, Henry has a realization. He says, "It's all the same. Nothing has changed." It's certainly a common line in this game. Ave repeated something similar, and Henry said something like this after helping Ava. But here it has a sort of finality to it. I mean, obviously, since we're in one of the endings. But it shows a deep-rooted stagnation that has taken hold in Henry's life. And it's especially fitting for this ending, since we ran away from the tall monster lady. Henry has once again chosen the familiar comfort over the terrifying uncertainty of change. In the end, nothing transforms, and Henry remains trapped in the same suffocating cycle that has slowly been killing him from within. When we leave the bedroom, Henry says, "This resembles my apartment, but the walls are wrinkled and faded, and the air is unnervingly still and stuffy, although the windows are broken. I feel there's a cold metal ball rolling around in my head. I feel not so good. Can't breathe. What is this place? Is this the way I'm going to... This is my life?" His apartment has become his tomb. Again, the same space that once offered him safety and comfort is now suffocating him, psychologically closing in on him. I suppose it's up to interpretation how Henry dies. It could be from hanging, as the news suggests. Actually, when we try to open the bathroom here, Henry says it's locked from the inside, and he can smell something horrible coming from there. Maybe he does eventually hang himself in the bathroom. Or maybe the noose and the suffocating atmosphere are just metaphors for a slower, quieter kind of death. The one that comes from isolation and despair, and the slow erosion of one's will to live. Henry's death could mirror the fate of the so-called hikikomori in Japan, or the unfortunately growing number of young men in the West, the so-called NEETs, who, like Henry, retreat from a world that feels overwhelming, hostile, or maybe to them, meaningless. It's not just the material, physical isolation that kills them, but just the broader psychological abandonment, a gradual slipping away from society that leaves them more and more adrift. And of course, as he's thinking this, he looks at the blank frame. This frame is the representation of his entire experience, his loneliness, his isolation, his lack of meaning. Now he can finally see a billboard in front of the apartment, a woman highlighted in green, next to a man, and the phrase, "Something missing?" If we do confront the tall monster lady by slamming the closet on her hands, when we eventually get to the upper floor, we find Ava's camera. When we enter the bedroom, the peeker isn't there, but we hear a bell, associated with the scarecrow-looking monster. We take a picture of it and it disappears, and we have to do this multiple times throughout the apartment. The act of taking pictures, and maybe the camera itself, could be seen as a symbolic form of exposure, or more importantly, acknowledgement. By capturing images of the monster, Henry is forced to confront it directly, rather than hiding or repressing. Like the tall monster lady, he's confronting it willingly, not letting it fester in the shadow, or I guess not letting it exist in this lovi, this metaphysical space. So we've already talked about how this monster wears these clock hands on its feet, which could represent Henry's passage through time in complete solitude, inching closer to a certain death. But to add to the symbolism of this monster, Henry's death could be represented through its body resembling kind of a hanged man, covered in a sheet you might use to cover a corpse. This whole design in general to me just sort of reeks of death. But then we have its face, a blank picture frame. This is the ultimate symbol of Henry's isolation, his lack of connection, his solitude, Henry's life reduced to this hollow, unfulfilled existence. We take the final picture of it and it disappears. We go to look at the blank frame, and Ava shows up behind us. She says, "Taken a liking to my camera? It was great. Ava, this place, you haven't seen my apartment, but whoa, easy. We're advancing a bit quickly, don't you think? How about we go out and get something to eat? Fresh air alone is enough for me. You done here? Ready to go? Yeah, let's go." You did it. Did what? You made it out. Well, I couldn't have done it by myself. No, it was all you. Trust me. It's interesting that Ava insists he got out all by himself. I think, in a sense, she's right. At the end of the day, it was Henry's own will that got him out of his apartment. Ava doesn't just represent a nice, cute girl that Henry is interested in. She, for all intents and purposes, might as well represent everything outside Henry's comfort zone. And what got him out was his will to get out, to accept all the unpredictability, beauty, and honestly, pain in the outside, to see what else this world has to offer besides the four walls of his bedroom. Even the manifestation of these monsters, and all the borderline supernatural happenings around the apartment, could be seen as a manifestation of his own, to borrow Jungian and Freudian terms, neurosis, a way for his unconscious to lash out and warn his self of the destructive life he lives. In The Symbolic Life, Jung tells us, "I am not altogether pessimistic about neurosis. In many cases, we have to say, thank heaven he can make up his mind to be neurotic. Neurosis is really an attempt at self-cure. It is an attempt of the self-regulating psychic system to restore the balance, in no way different from the function of dreams, only rather more forceful and drastic." Henry and Ava go get something to eat. Perhaps Henry will now have something to fill that blank frame.
Meow.